On the afternoon of Sunday 8th June 1913, two ploughmen from Nidri Farm, James Thompson and Thomas Duncan, went out to check on the cattle near the old Hopetoun Quarry in West Lothian, when they spotted a dark object floating in the water. Initially, they thought it was a prank, or maybe a sheep. After poking it with the branch of a tree, they realised it was two small bodies, fully clothed, tied together with window cord, although the cord broke when Duncan tried to lift the bundle to the bank. He managed to get one of the bodies to the bank, then went to get help from his father, Peter, who told them to inform the authorities. Police Constable Galbraith and PC James Adamson arrived quickly and managed to bring the second bundle to dry land, where the two lay until the arrival of the Procurator Fiscal, Mr. McKnight, Dr. Robert Cross, Deputy Chief Constable Henry Robinson, and Inspector Corsi of Linlithgow Police later that afternoon. From the size of the bodies, it was obvious they were dealing with two dead children. The children's bodies were moved to Linlithgow Police Station for a post-mortem, where it was deemed they'd been in the water for around 6 months. Dr. Cross thought the bodies were just too decomposed to carry out an autopsy, and that it would be a waste of time, but the Procurator Fiscal thought it would be worthwhile. The following day, Dr. Cross and the Chief Surgeon to Police, Dr. Henry Harvey Littlejohn, better known as Harvey Littlejohn, of Edinburgh, carried out the post-mortem along with the pathologist, Sidney Smith. It was thanks to Littlejohn and Smith that the bodies were quickly identified. During their initial examination of the boys, they discovered that both bodies had been exceptionally well preserved due to the body fat turning into adipocere, a solid fatty substance caused by the bodies being underwater for a long period of time. Due to this change in the body being a slow process, Littlejohn and Smith concluded the bodies had been submerged for at least 18 months to 2 years. The police now had a timeline to work with, and the children had both been identified as male, with one aged around 6 or 7. The other was estimated to be between 2 and 4. The boys' stomach contents were well preserved, and Smith could say exactly what they'd last eaten: barley, potatoes, turnips, whole green peas and leeks, the ingredients for Scotch broth. He estimated the boys had last eaten in the late summer or autumn of 1911. He could also estimate that they'd probably eaten it around an hour before their deaths, leading to speculation that they were most likely to be local. With the evidence mounting up, police managed to identify the remains of the children fairly quickly as two boys from Winchburgh who had disappeared in November 1911. They were 7-year-old William Higgins and his 5-year-old brother, John. Married in 1902 to Bridget Johnson, their father, Patrick Higgins from Broxburn, was a widower, as Bridget had died in 1910. For years, Higgins had worked odd jobs, labouring mostly, and working at the local Winchburgh shale and brickworks, or at a local threshing mill. He'd enlisted in the army when he was 19 and served in India with the Scottish Rifles for 6 or 7 years, but had been discharged due to epilepsy. He'd been jailed previously for neglecting his sons for 2 months, and when he was released, he'd put them into the care of a Broxburn woman, a widow called Elizabeth Hines. The boys had stayed with her for around a month in October 1911. However, by the end of the month, she'd received no money, and she thought that when they disappeared, Higgins had simply picked them up from outside the house. She'd gone to the Winchburgh brickworks to ask after Higgins, and was told that all three had left to go to Edinburgh the previous evening. At the time, the local authorities were considering removing the children to a children's home in Lanark. She went on to tell the police that in May 1912, Higgins had appeared at her door, worse the wear for drink. Anxious to hear about the children, she invited him in and asked after them. He told her they were dead, and when she asked if it was diphtheria, which was prevalent at the time, he replied no, they'd drowned. She thought it was the ravings of a drunk man, although a lodger at her house told her she should report it to the police, but she didn't think it was worth it. Police also spoke to local workers from the brickyard who socialised with Higgins. Hugh Shields, a miner, remembered seeing him one wet, stormy evening in November, walking with the boys towards the quarry. Higgins was next seen at a local pub without them, where one of his workmates, James Daly, asked where they were. He told him 2 women on a train had taken a liking to them, so he'd simply handed the boys over to them. This was the same story he told his sister, Margaret Owens, telling her the women had given him 25 shillings. However, his lies began unravelling when he gave varying accounts about his missing sons, including that they were away at their school, in Canada, and gone to glory. Higgins was arrested at his lodging house in Broxburn on Monday 9th June 1913 by 4 police officers. They woke up the keeper at 2 o'clock in the morning. Not really knowing his lodgers well, he told them that one of his lodgers would know who Higgins was, as he'd been there for a long time. He went upstairs and knocked on one of the bedroom doors, and inside were 2 men, and when he explained, one of the men turned to him and said, "That's me they want, I believe." He quickly dressed, then was escorted to Linlithgow jail, and although he admitted to being in trouble with the authorities regarding his children, Higgins showed no concern about the present inquiry. The Deputy Chief Constable, Robinson, escorted Higgins to the mortuary, where he identified his sons. Higgins appeared in private before Sheriff MacLeod at Linlithgow Sheriff Court the day after his arrest, on the charge of murdering his 2 boys. McKnight, the Procurator Fiscal, addressed Higgins and the Sheriff. He stated, "Patrick Higgins, at present in custody, did between August 24th, 1911 and June 8th, 1913 at a disused quarry known as Hopetoun Quarry in Abercorn Parish, Linlithgow, in which there was a large quantity of water, assault John Higgins, aged about 7 years, and William Higgins, aged about 5 years, his children. Did tie them together with a cord, did throw them into the said quarry, and did leave them in the water, and did murder them." Higgins was represented by Solicitor Norman Main, but made no plea or declaration, and was subsequently removed to Carlton Jail in Edinburgh to await trial at the High Court in the city. On Wednesday, 10th September 1913, Higgins, who pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity and was defended by his counsel, Mr. J. Ogilvy Kemp, stood trial before Henry Johnston, Lord Johnson. The following day he was found guilty of the murder of his sons, a unanimous verdict by the jury, thanks to the forensic evidence from Littlejohn and Smith. The foreman read out the verdict, stating, "We find the prisoner guilty, with a recommendation to mercy owing to the length of time which has elapsed between the act and the apprehension of the prisoner, and the want of expert evidence as to the mental condition of the prisoner at the time." The judge ignored the plea for clemency and passed the death sentence, stating he'd been convicted of a heinous crime against God, against man, and against nature, and for such a crime there is only one penalty of the law. He was described by the Lord Advocate Alexander Ure, on behalf of the Crown, as just a cold, callous, morally depraved creature who preferred his own selfish indulgence to discharging his obligation as a parent of the children. Higgins was hanged on the morning of Thursday, 2nd October 1913 at Calton Jail. He was 37 years old and the last man to be hanged at the prison. However, controversy followed the case. Little John called in to see Smith at some point and said, "Just what I need for my museum." He was referring to the bodies of the dead children during the post-mortem. They body snatched them years after body snatching was outlawed. Years later, Smith admitted it was his idea and described what happened. There were 2 police officers with them in the mortuary, so the pair chatted in hushed tones, and it was suggested they should take samples for teaching purposes. Little John managed to distract the officers and get them out of the room, allowing Smith free rein. Parts of the bodies were wrapped up in numerous parcels, with one of them being the stomach. Little John asked Smith when he saw them, "What else have you got?" Smith had wrapped up 2 heads, a leg, and an arm from each, and all the internal organs. Smith claimed it was an incredible example of adipocere, seeing the boys' remains as specimens to be shown while teaching. The body parts of John and William Higgins were used for at least 40 years as teaching tools, and the 2 little boys who'd lost their lives so cruelly would have to wait to get the funeral they deserved. They were finally laid to rest in 2009 at Morton Hall Crematorium in Edinburgh. If you enjoyed this episode of Scotland's History, please like, comment and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching.